So I'm going to walk you through now a possible essay plan and a way of approaching this type of essay question with the 3 parts with an application element as well. You'll notice here that social support and locus of control are the 2 explanations that I'm going to be focusing on. A few of you chose to write about explanations of conformity and explanations of obedience. So for instance, group size, unanimity, the presence of an authority figure wearing a uniform, the location of the experiments, etc. That unfortunately wasn't correct for this type of for this question. Had you written about the inverse of those factors, so for instance, if you spoke about a reduced group size or the lack of a uniform in the authority figure, that would have been fine. They would have been sound explanations. But the question was clearly referring to resistance to social influences rather than conformity or obedience to social influences. So unless you talked about the inverse of those things, unless you talked about a smaller group size or the lack of a uniform, I couldn't credit you any marks for that, for those explanations, unfortunately. So I think it's really clear in the question itself that this is referring to social support and locus of control. You'll notice by Jack and Sarah's statements that they were clearly asking you to write about those explanations. And as you had done in essays very, very similar to this just recently, you should have been able to include some research support and some good evaluation points for these 2 explanations. So let's first of all focus on social support. So you'll remember that social support is support from other people who are also defying the pressure to conform or obey. And you'll know that this is a situational factor. So this depends on the circumstances or the situation you're in. And we know that if there is social support, if there are other defiant people or other non-conforming people, that disobedient behaviour is less likely to stand out. And this gives the observer the confidence to also resist social influences. So here you didn't need to speak about both a non-conformity and disobedience. You could have just spoken about one, but the essays I saw that achieved highly in the AO1 did discuss both and had research support to explain and support both explanations. So you remember that when we were studying resistance to social influences, we looked at a number of key studies that you were already really familiar with, one of those being Ash's experiments with the line task. And in one variation of this study, Ash had a confederate who was disagreeing with the majority answer, and you remember that he found that conformity dropped from 32% from the original experiments to just 5.5%. So it's really clear that when a participant sees a dissenter or a non-conformist, that it makes them more confident with their own decision. And so if somebody sees another person expressing what they believed, that gives them the confidence, that gives them the social support and increases the likelihood that they'll resist conforming, that they'll resist agreeing with the incorrect majority. So the key study there that you could mention was, of course, Ash's experiment and the variation of his experiment. Another one for AO3 that you could have mentioned is Allen and Levine's study. And you remember that they did a variation again of Ash's visual perception task. And they found that when a dissenter wore glasses, so when a non-conformist wore glasses and admitted to having vision problems, even the fact that they provided the correct answer or that they agreed with the participant meant that it gave the participant the confidence they needed to also go with their correct answer and to not conform to the incorrect answer of the group, even when that person admitted to having vision problems and was not necessarily a valid form of social support. So it seems then that any type of social support, valid or not, provides the participant with the confidence to not conform and to resist social influences. When we consider defiance or disobedience, immediately you should be thinking about Milgram's experiments and the variations of his experiments. And we studied one in particular where confederates were working in teams of 3 with the participant. So in this case we had 3 teachers rather than just the regular 1 in Milgram's original experiments. And we know that when the other teachers working with our participant left the study early on and refused to administer the electric shocks, that their obedience rate dropped from 65% in the original experiments to just 10%. And we know, conversely, that when the participant was paired with 2 obedient confederates, so with 2 confederates that did administer the shocks all the way up to 450 volts, the obedience rate increased from 65% up to 92.5%. So here we know that social support creates a new group norm of disobedience. So if we have disobedient models there, creates a new group norm saying that this is okay now to disobey, and that gives the individuals or the participants more confidence to resist the temptation to also obey, and therefore they're more likely to resist social influences if they have that social support from the disobedient models. In terms of AO3 content for defiance or disobedience as an explanation for resistance to social influences, there's also the Gamson study. So you remember that this is the study where participants were made to believe that they were taking part in a study by a human resources consultancy agency, and they were asked to discuss an impending court case while they were videotaped. So they were asked to discuss Mr. C, who was the petrol station manager, and he was having his franchise revoked because the oil company claimed that he was behaving immorally by living with a young woman who he was not married to, and they believed that he was then unfit to be a representative of their franchise. Mr. C was suing the oil company for unfair dismissal, saying that he was getting sacked because he had criticised the oil company's decision to raise the prices. So in this study, the participants were manipulated, essentially. So they were asked about their attitudes towards Mr. C and his lifestyle, at which point then the cameras were switched off while the groups were arguing. And they were turned off at specific times. They were turned off when the group were arguing that they were offended by his behaviour, and the cameras were only rolling when they were saying that they were offended by his behaviour. So the group then really realised that they were being manipulated to produce supporting evidence to be used in the trial. They found that after the discussion, when the participants were asked to sign a false affidavit, so a false document saying that they gave permission for the videotapes to be used as court evidence, they found that there was some rebellion in every single group, and that 29 out of 33 of the groups of 9 participants refused to sign the document. In each group, there were some members who wished to obey the company and sign the affidavit, but they found that the presence of dissenters led to group disobedience. So having the presence of some people who were voicing their concerns and were disobedient and refusing to sign the form, they found that other people would get swept along with this, that other people were then likely to also disobey. So just having a few dissenters, a few disobedient models in the group, then created a new group norm of disobedience. And this led then to 29 of the 33 groups not signing the affidavit, therefore being disobedient. So for both of these experiments on social support and disobedience, for Milgram, Gamson, Ash and Alan Levine, there are a number of AO3 evaluation points that you could include. So for instance, for Gamson, you could argue that it's an observation rather than an experiment, so it's impossible then to control certain variables and impossible to establish a cause and effect relationship. For Milgram and Ash, of course, you're very familiar with some of the limitations of that study in terms of ecological validity, in terms of mundane realism and ethical considerations, of course, as well. And those same factors also apply for Alan Levine's study. So a lot of these have been conducted in labs and therefore may lack external validity. So for AO1 content here, a discussion of social support, what it is, and how it can lead to resistance of social influences, as well as an explanation of how non-conforming allies and disobedient models can reduce resistance, can increase resistance to social influences and resist conformity and obedience. And then a discussion of some of our studies here. So you didn't have to, of course, discuss all of these, but having a good variety, a good selection would, of course, increase your AO3 mark for that particular part of the question. For AO3 points, you could get points for a variety of reasons. One, of course, would be quoting the scenario and then mentioning, of course, that Sarah was, of course, discussing situational factors. So Sarah's comment about the presence of others indicates then social support and is suggesting that social support is influential in resisting social influences. So that's half of the question there. Let's have a look now at locus of control. In general, I think you had a better understanding of locus of control than you did social support, although a number of you were getting locus of control mixed up with authoritarian personality, so that's something to revise if you got those confused. So locus of control, of course, refers to the extent to which individuals believe they are in control of their own lives, and it's measured along a continuum. So it's a personality factor or a dispositional factor, as Jack mentions. So for AO1 marks here, you'll need to explain what locus of control is, in that it's a personality factor, and that it's the extent to which individuals perceive they have control over their own lives. And then an explanation of internal and external locus of control. So remember that people that have high internal locus of control believe they can affect the outcomes of situations. So they believe that their own choices and their decisions affect what happens to them. So for instance, if they study hard, they'll get good marks in the exam. Whereas people with external locus of control tend to believe that things turn out a certain way regardless of their actions. So it's external forces in the environment that affect what happens to them. So this could be fate or luck, or it could be the fact that the questions on the exam were too hard, or the teachers are harsh markers. But it's of course nothing to do with how hard they've worked or their own decisions. So an explanation of internal and external locus of control is necessary for good AO1 marks there. Of course, then, an explanation of how this relates to the question. So remember, this question was referring to explanations of resistance to social influences. So an explanation of how internal and external locus of control aids in resisting social influences is necessary. So remember that people that are high on internal locus of control show more independent behaviour and thoughts. They rely less on other people's opinions, they're more likely to lead, and this then allows them to show greater resistance to social influences. People that have external locus of control, however, rely more on other people's opinions and are more likely to follow. So these are people that will not be able to resist coercion from other people and more likely to rely on what other people are saying. So therefore, they're less able to resist social influences. So there is plenty of research support for locus of control and for the explanation of locus of control influencing resistance to social influences. The first, of course, is Elms and Milgram. So you remember this study was where they followed up the disobedient participants that participated in Milgram's original experiments. So they traced all the people that did not go up to the 450 volts, and they gave them a locus of control test, much like the one that I gave you in class. And they found that disobedient participants had a high internal locus of control compared to the participants that were obedient, who showed a higher external locus of control. So this provides then support that a strong internal locus of control plays an important role in resisting orders to obey. Another example of some research support that could be used for AO3 for locus of control would be Oliner and Oliner's study. So this one, I think, was the number one study that was mentioned by a lot of you. I think one of the easiest to remember as well. So this is where they investigated the locus of control of non-Jewish people who had protected Jews during the Holocaust in Germany. They found that rescuers, so the people that were protecting Jews, showed a higher internal locus of control than non-rescuers. And so again, this shows us that locus of control is important in resisting social influences. So we know that higher internal locus of control means greater resistance to social influences. Another potential study that you could have discussed for AO3 points would be the Abacus meta-analysis, where he found that individuals with internal locus of control were less easily persuaded and less likely to conform. So this again supports the idea that internal locus of control is linked to a greater resistance to social influences. Another study that you could have mentioned, which I in fact don't have written on there, is Spector. So Spector was the researcher who investigated the locus of control in undergraduate students, and he found the correlation between locus of control and resistance to normative social influence, but not informational social influence. So this could be an evaluation point in which you're suggesting that locus of control is limited in explaining resistance to social influences. And other possible studies which contradict or provide contradictory evidence to locus of control, being able to explain resistance to social influence, is a study by Williams and Warshall. So they were the investigators that found that it was assertiveness rather than locus of control that could explain differences in conformity. So they found that higher assertiveness meant greater resistance to conformity rather than locus of control. So you could have used that study as an evaluation point either. For AO2 marks here for locus of control, they mention that locus of control is a dispositional factor and that dispositional factors are important in the resisting social influence, would get you a mark, as would suggesting that the strong personality or a confident personality mentioned by Jack is referring to locus of control, and that locus of control has a role in making somebody better able to resist social influences. So I think this was more or less a straightforward question, particularly as you had done a similar essay recently, or just a few weeks prior to the exam. The only difference with this one, of course, is that there's AO2, there's an application element to this question as well. So mentioning the scenario, mentioning about Jack, and mentioning Sarah, and providing quotes from the STEM is really important as well. So if you can include quotes such as confident personality and the presence of others, that will help you with your AO2 marks there as well.